This video is part of a collaboration series on Indian history. Please see the link in the description for the playlist. For the video before mine, check out Voices of the Past video on an Indian perspective of Europe. For the video after mine, please see Hikmah History's video on the Muslim invasions of India. With that said, let's get started. In 851 CE, an Arab chronicle, the Silsilat al-Tawarik, described the Rashtrakuta dynasty as one of the four principal empires in the entire world. This wasn't just some fanciful exaggeration. At the height of its power, the Rashtrakuta dynasty ruled over a vast portion of the Indian subcontinent. But unlike other massive empires in Indian history, such as the Mauryas and the Guptas, the Rashtrakuta dynasty was not a North Indian entity. In fact, it was South Indian, with its base in the semi-arid Deccan region. So why push north aggressively? The Rashtrakutas sought to imperialize Kannauj and the central Ganges Valley, the heart of North India. By controlling Kannauj, the Rashtrakutas would gain access over prosperous North Indian trade networks. It also represented imperial legitimacy on a grand scale. But the Rashtrakutas were not alone in their ambitions. They were challenged by two chief rivals, the Pratiharas in the northwest and the Pallavas in the northeast. This tripartite struggle over the heart of North India in many ways defined the era. This is a story of kings and empires, of raw power and ambition in a forgotten age. The story of the Rashtrakuta Empire begins in the 730s CE. As a feudatory to the Chalukya Empire, the Rashtrakuta leader Dantidurga helped repulse two Arab invasions that would have otherwise swallowed up South India. Dantidurga's impressive wins against the Arab invaders on the battlefield, and his growing prestige, cleared a path to greater glory. Over the next decade and a half, he independently subdued various kings in central India, then formed a marriage alliance with the Pallava king in Tamil country. By 753 CE, Dantidurga's areas of influence now encircled the Chalukyas. As the Pallavas picked away at the Chalukyas from the south, Dantidurga launched his assault on their core territories. Dantidurga died in 756 CE, having established the beginnings of the Rashtrakuta Empire. After his death, his uncle Krishna I ascended the throne and finished off the remaining Chalukya stragglers. By 757 CE, the Rashtrakutas had completely displaced their former masters. But Krishna I wasn't done, and his eagerness to expand the empire through brutal warfare was typical for the dynasty. He conquered the Ganga dynasty and the Konkan coastal regions, bringing them under his control, and he invaded the eastern Chalukyas, forcing them to submit as feudatories to his imperial authority. Krishna I even found time to construct the mind-blowing rock-cut Kailasha temple at Ellora, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. By the end of Krishna I's life in 774 CE, the Rashtrakuta dynasty had stabilized its core territories and established itself as the premier military, cultural, and economic power in South India. And soon, the empire would extend its influence further north. As a quick aside, the Rashtrakuta military would have been constructed like other early medieval armies in India, with substantial numbers of infantry, cavalry, and a well-trained elephant corps. Notably, though peasant soldiers would be given minimal armor, elite soldiers and nobility would wear chainmail waistcoats. Cavalry was by far the most important contingent of the military during this era. In fact, even Rashtrakuta coinage featured cavalry symbolism, a rather aggressive touch. Now, to understand the northward expansion of the Rashtrakutas, we must first understand the balance of power in India at that time. The Rashtrakutas were not the only ambitious players in medieval India. Around the same time that the Rashtrakuta dynasty was founded, two other dynasties were founded. The Pratiharas in northwestern India, centered in what is today known as Rajasthan, and the Pallavas in northeastern India, centered in what is today known as Bengal. The Rashtrakutas were primed for a particularly intense conflict with the Pratiharas on the basis of their shared frontier regions, Gujarat and Malwa. But all three dynasties would be repeatedly brought into conflict with one another thanks to their interest in the same prize, control over the heart of North India, and the legendary city of Kannauj. During this era, the local leadership in Kannauj was shattered and weak, and ripe for the picking. It finally made sense for a South Indian empire to attempt to take over, and it was a significant prize indeed. Kannauj was not only prosperous, but its capture would lend legitimacy to any empire on a large scale. Further, control over Kannauj and the central Ganges Valley would allow access to extensive North Indian trade networks, giving all three seaborne empires an advantage in the commercial sphere. The tripartite struggle did not begin in earnest until the rise of Rashtrakuta Emperor Dhruva I in 780 CE. Dhruva I initially consolidated power by subduing his southern rivals and suppressing several rebellions. Having established a secure hold on his core territories, he looked north. At the time, the Pallavas controlled Kannauj and were in a position of strength. According to the inscriptional evidence, the Rashtrakutas first engaged the Pratiharas in central India and easily put them to flight, sending them running back to the safety of their desert homeland and taking Gujarat and Malwa for themselves. Having routed the Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas then proceeded towards Kannauj. At Kannauj, the Rashtrakutas succeeded in driving the Pallavas out. Little is known of this invasion, though it was more of a raid than a long-term attempt at control. Supposedly, the Rashtrakuta war elephants shook the foundations of the Kannauj temples as they plundered them of their wealth. With a substantial amount of plunder in hand, Dhruva's armies quickly returned to South India. Back in South India, Dhruva I made the pesky eastern Chalukyas into feudatories once again, forcing a fragile peace by marriage to the daughter of the eastern Chalukya king. Thus began the tripartite struggle. Unfortunately, Dhruva I's military successes were short-lived. After Dhruva I's death, his third son and successor, Govinda III, was put in an unenviable strategic position. Though he ascended the throne in 793 CE, it was not a smooth transition. In fact, his older brother, Kambarasa, was so convinced of his own right to rule that he went to war over the throne. Kambarasa was no easy rival. He had the support of an alliance of 12 feudatories, including the powerful Western Ganga king Shivamara II. In time, Govinda III defeated Kambarasa and secured the throne. At the end of the civil war, Govinda III awarded his defeated brother with a viceroyalty in the Gangavati region. This show of mercy quashed potential ill will surrounding the war, but the succession dispute gave others opportunity to revolt or change their loyalties. In just a few years, Malwa and Gujarat returned to Pratihara control, and Kannauj returned to Palla control. Meanwhile, in a move surprising absolutely no one, the pesky eastern Chalukyas again declared their independence. Govinda III acted decisively, not only to recover old feudatories, but to expand the empire beyond its old boundaries. In 800 CE, he launched a multi-year campaign through central India and towards Kannauj in North India. Govinda III's campaigns against the Pratihara king, Nagabhatta II, in Gujarat and Malwa were extraordinarily successful. With the Pratiharas pushed back, Govinda III decided not to make the same mistake that his father had made. Instead of allowing existing leaders to continue as his feudatories, he established entirely new dynasties in Gujarat and Malwa that would be loyal to the Rashtrakuta Empire. In Gujarat, Govinda III placed his brother Indra on the throne, starting a new branch of the Rashtrakuta dynasty. In Malwa, Govinda III handpicked the Paramara dynasty to take the reins as loyal feudatories to the Rashtrakuta. With these problematic borderlands now integrated into the core territories of the empire, Govinda III pushed ahead towards Kannauj. He not only captured Kannauj, but obtained the formal submission of King Dharmapala of the Pallavas. Thus, Govinda III had carved out a more stable empire than his father, though Kannauj, so far away from the Rashtrakuta core, would ultimately fall into Pratihara hands within a few decades. In describing Govinda III's northern expedition, the Sanjan inscription says, "The horses of Emperor Govinda III drank from icy Himalayan streams, and his war elephants tasted the sacred waters of the Ganges." New concerns soon called Govinda III back south. Surprise, surprise, the eastern Chalukyas were aggressing, and it demanded an immediate response. Govinda III returned and defeated the eastern Chalukyas soundly, and just as he did with his other conquests, he put his own puppet ruler on their throne, a man named Bhima Salki. On the way down south from the northern expedition, Govinda III's wife gave birth to a son along the banks of the Narmada River. This son was named Amogavarsha, and was destined to become the greatest emperor of the Rashtrakuta lineage. His reign, lasting 62 years, and mostly peaceful, is among the longest recorded monarchical reigns in world history. Amogavarsha came to power at just 14 years old. As such, he was under the guardianship of his loyal cousin, Karka, until he was old enough and skilled enough to handle royal duties on his own. In Amogavarsha's early years, the empire was in a state of disarray for a brief period due to a revolt started by the feudatory Shivamara II. You might recall that it was Shivamara II who aided the rebellious faction in Kambarasa's civil war, some 2 decades prior. Shivamara II certainly had a bone to pick with the Rashtrakutas. His revolt briefly unseated Amogavarsha from power, but Amogavarsha, with the aid of his loyal cousin and guardian, Karka, managed to turn things around. Shivamara II was killed in battle, and a conciliatory marriage policy was soon adopted to end the war diplomatically. Amogavarsha was back on the throne. But the chaos wasn't over yet. The eastern Chalukyas overthrew Bhima Salki and re-established their lineage as independent kings. Soon, they conducted hostilities against the Rashtrakutas, but an offering of a Rashtrakuta princess eventually bought peace. Amoghavarsha also brokered the marriage of a Rashtrakuta princess to the Pallava king to minimize conflict further south. Thus, by 821 CE, Amoghavarsha had established a stable empire, and he ruled under relative peace until 877 CE. Notably, Amoghavarsha was less interested in northern wars of expansion. His reign can be aptly described as a golden age of economic prosperity, cultural expression, and diplomatic influence. First, he moved the capital to Manyakheta, and was said to have built a city so grand that it seemed to have sprouted from ancient mythology. Though Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism were officially patronized religions, the Arab traveler Suleiman wrote that Amoghavarsha made efforts to construct mosques for the many Muslim citizens, merchants, and others living in the Rashtrakuta Empire. In fact, Suleiman compared the diverse and mostly peaceful nature of Amoghavarsha's reign to that of the legendary Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. The multi-religious, syncretic culture established by the Rashtrakutas would be made evident half a century later, when in 926 CE, a Rashtrakuta emperor appointed an Arab Muslim as governor of the important province of Sanjan. This friendliness towards Muslims was partly a function of Rashtrakuta political policy. As an empire with a vast west-facing coastline, the Rashtrakutas' best trading partners were in the Arab world. It also relied on allied Muslim kingdoms to apply military pressure on the borders of the Pratiharas. Religious tolerance was therefore of strategic importance. Amoghavarsha himself was a Jain convert from Hinduism, and a patron of both the religious and secular arts. It is during his reign that Jainism began to flourish throughout the Deccan region. Many unique Jain temples were built during this time, and in fact today some of these temples in Karnataka are designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Scholars, prose writers, and poets of all stripes were patronized by Amoghavarsha's court, but especially those writing in the Kannada language. His court was extravagant with its spending on scholarly and religious works, and many of the most famous Indian scholars of the era lived and worked at Manyakheta. While ruling from Manyakheta, Amoghavarsha even found the time to author the earliest extant literary work in Kannada, the Kaviraja Marga. He also wrote a religious work in the Sanskrit language. Towards the end of his long life, it is believed that Amoghavarsha abdicated the throne to pursue religious interests. The next 100 years of the Rashtrakutas were mostly a repeat of the factional conflicts and military aggression of the past. Routinely, the Eastern Chalukyas would take an antagonistic stance and would be invaded. They would either successfully repulse the Rashtrakutas or be forced to serve as feudatories. Similarly, Kalinga and Kannauj changed their status regularly. Tamil country also continued to be a problem, as the rise of the Cholas brought a new challenger in the campaign for control of the south. In any case, the tripartite struggle reignited in earnest during the reign of Indra III, between 914 CE and 929 CE. Indra III took the throne and immediately set about preparing a campaign to take Kannauj after sensing weakness among the Pratiharas, who were experiencing internal conflict due to a family dispute. Indra III successfully took Kannauj, which remained in Rashtrakuta hands until the 930s CE. After a series of short-lived emperors, Krishna III ascended the throne in 939 CE as the last able monarch of the Rashtrakuta dynasty. He built a strong economy at home, patronized a number of cultural icons, such as the Kannada poet Sri Ponna, and engaged in a series of campaigns deep into the north and south to rebuild the empire. Among his accomplishments is his decisive win against the Cholas at the Battle of Takkalam in 949 CE. In fact, the Battle of Takkalam was such a success for the Rashtrakutas that it sent the Cholas into decades of internal chaos and allowed for an occupation of Tamil country. All because a stray arrow killed the Chola commander, winning the battle at a critical stage. The Rashtrakutas under Krishna III reached their maximum territorial extent, expanding their influence from Sri Lanka in the south to the Himalayas in the north, and gaining direct access to both the western and eastern seas. But Krishna III made one fatal mistake, gifting a large territory in the heart of the empire to one of his best commanders, Tailapa II, a man who had an ancient blood claim to the throne. In 972 CE, the Paramaras, once a puppet dynasty installed by the Rashtrakutas, sensed weakness and invaded, plundering Manyakheta. Rashtrakuta leadership was forced to flee the city, and the weakness of the empire was suddenly made clear to their feudatories. Tailapa II declared independence, and he quickly gained the allegiances of many of the feudatories previously loyal to the Rashtrakutas. He then captured Manyakheta, finishing the takeover. By 973 CE, the collapse of the Rashtrakutas was complete. And so closed a legendary chapter in Indian history, one that has been neglected for far too long.